My brother sold my childhood home behind my back, claiming I had no right to it. He didn't check the basement vault. Our grandfather left a final gift there that legally voids any sale not signed by the oldest female descendant, me. The brass key I'd used for 30 years suddenly felt like a stranger in my hand, clicking uselessly against a lock that had been changed without a word of warning. I stood on the porch of Oak Haven with a bag of melting groceries, realizing the house wasn't just close to me, it had been stolen. My brother Julian pulled into the driveway in a car that smelled of fresh leather and betrayal, a smug grin plastered across his face as he told me the deed was already signed away. He thought he'd stripped me of my heritage for a quick payday, claiming the male heir took it all, but he was blinded by his own greed. Julian never bothered to look beneath the surface, and he had no idea that our grandfather left a secret in the basement vault that was about to turn his illegal sale into his biggest nightmare. The grocery bag finally gave way, the plastic handles snapping and sending a carton of milk bursting across the porch floor. I didn't even look down. My eyes were locked on Julian as he stepped out of that flashy blue sports car, his designer sunglasses reflecting the house he had just betrayed. He didn't look like a man who had just lost his father or a man who cared about his sister. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The jasmine in the garden was thick and sweet, a scent that usually brought me peace, but now it felt like it was choking me. This was the porch where we played as children, where our father sat every evening, and now, it was the site of a cold-blooded heist. "You can stop jiggling that handle, Sarah," Julian said, his voice dripping with a newfound arrogance. "I had the locksmith out here at 6 this morning. New security, new codes, new ownership. You're trespassing on private corporate property now." He leaned against the hood of his car, crossing his ankles as if he were posing for a magazine. "I signed the papers with Northridge Developers last Friday. They're bringing the bulldozers in by the end of the month. It's time to move on to the 21st century, don't you think?" The air felt thin, making it hard to breathe. I walked to the edge of the steps, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You sold the house, Julian? This is our home. This is where Dad wanted us to stay. We haven't even finished the mourning period and you're talking about bulldozers." I looked at the peeling white paint on the railings, a project I had planned to finish this summer. I realized then that Julian had never seen this place as a home. To him, it was just a giant check waiting to be cashed. He had spent his life looking for the easy way out, and he had finally found it at my expense. Julian's eyes narrowed behind his expensive lenses. "Dad was an old man with old ideas, Sarah. He left everything to me as the son because he knew a woman couldn't manage a property of this size. It's the way things are done in families like ours. You should be thanking me. I'm clearing out all that old junk so you don't have to worry about it. I've left your boxes in the shed. You have until tomorrow morning to clear them out before the fence goes up." He didn't wait for a response. He just slid back into his leather interior and roared away, the gravel spitting out from under his tires like a parting insult. I sat on the top step, the spilled milk drying in the afternoon sun. I thought back to the final weeks of our father's life. I remembered Julian sitting in the corner of the hospital room, not holding Dad's hand but tapping away on his phone. I remembered him asking for the keys to the study, to organize the bills. I had been so consumed by the grief of losing our last parent that I hadn't seen the shark circling the waters. He had been calculating the square footage of our memories while I was trying to remember the sound of my father's laughter. The rift between us wasn't just about money, it was about the fact that Julian lacked a soul. As the shadows grew long and the air turned chilly, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. I walked around to the old garden shed near the back of the property. It was a weather-beaten little shack filled with rusted trowels and the scent of dry earth. I found an old wool blanket and some burlap sacks to make a makeshift bed. Through the small, grimy window of the shed, I watched the lights of the house. Julian hadn't even stayed. He was probably off at some high-end bar celebrating his genius business move. The house looked dark and abandoned, a hollowed-out version of its former self. I lay there in the dark, the cold seeping through the floorboards. I thought about Grandfather Silas, the man who had built Oak Haven with his own 2 hands. He was a man of secrets and steel. He always used to say that the roots of this house go deeper than any paper can reach. At the time I thought he was just talking about the oak trees, but lying there in the silence his voice felt like a warning. He had always been closer to me than to Julian, perhaps because he saw the same greed in his grandson that he had fought against his whole life. He had left me his signet ring for a reason. I pulled the heavy gold ring from my pocket, the onyx stone gleaming in the moonlight. I remembered the day he gave it to me. He was frail, his voice a mere whisper, but his grip on my hand was like a vice. He told me that if the house ever felt like it was falling, I should look where the fire begins. I had spent years wondering what that meant. Suddenly, the image of the basement furnace flashed into my mind, the massive cast-iron beast that sat in the dark heart of the basement. I remembered a hidden door I had seen once as a child, tucked behind a stack of coal crates. Julian never went into the basement, he was too afraid of the spiders and the damp. A spark of hope flickered in my chest, warming me more than the wool blanket ever could. Julian thought he had won because he had a signed contract and a fancy car. He thought he could erase our history with a pen stroke. But he didn't know the house like I did. He didn't know about the vault, and he certainly didn't know about the final gift our grandfather had stashed away for the woman of the house. As I closed my eyes in the drafty shed, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a guardian. Tomorrow I would find a way back into that basement, and I would find the truth that Julian was too arrogant to even look for. The battle for Oak Haven was only just beginning. The night air was a cold, sharp blade, and the silence of the estate was broken only by the rhythmic crunch of my footsteps on the frost-covered grass. I crept around the side of the house, keeping low to avoid the sweep of the new security lights Julian had installed on the garage. He had hired a private patrol to circle the property, a pair of men in a white sedan who seemed more interested in their thermoses of coffee than in the shadows of the garden. I reached the side of the porch where the old coal chute was hidden behind a dense thicket of overgrown boxwood. It was a narrow rusted iron flap that hadn't been used since the 50s, but I knew the latch was loose. With a grunt of effort that made my muscles protest, I pried the metal open. The smell of wet earth and ancient soot billowed out, a dark welcome home. I lowered myself into the opening, my boots searching for purchase on the slippery stone walls of the chute. I slid down, landing with a muffled thud on a pile of leftover anthracite and dust. The basement was a cavern of deep shadows, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the pilot light on the massive iron furnace. The air here was different, heavy, damp, and smelling of laundry soap and coal dust. As I stood up, brushing the grime from my jacket, the furnace groaned and clicked into a low hum, a sound that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. It felt like the house was exhaling, recognizing me even if my brother didn't. I navigated the familiar maze of wooden pillars and hanging cobwebs, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Julian's ignorance was my only advantage. He had always viewed the basement as a filthy pit, a place for spiders and damp rot. He hadn't ventured down here in a decade, preferring the polished marble and clean lines of the upper floors. I moved toward the back wall behind the furnace, where the shadows were the thickest. There lay a mountain of discarded history, old steamer trunks, crates of broken china, and stacks of water-damaged newspapers. I began to move them one heavy box at a time. My fingernails broke and my palms grew raw from the friction of the rough wood, but I didn't stop. I felt a desperate, primal need to reach the stones beneath. After an hour of back-breaking labor, I cleared enough space to see it. There, set deep into the gray masonry and partially covered by a thick layer of soot, was a heavy steel door. It wasn't large, barely 3 feet high, but it looked impenetrable. A massive rusted iron wheel sat in the center, looking like something pulled from the bulkhead of an old ship. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, feeling the pitting of age. It was a marvel of Grandfather Silas's engineering, a secret hidden in plain sight. Julian had sold the house based on a survey of the rooms he could see, never realizing that the most valuable part of the foundation was tucked away in a corner he was too arrogant to inspect. I grabbed the iron wheel with both hands, bracing my feet against the stone floor. It didn't budge. I pulled until my vision blurred and my muscles screamed, but the rust had fused the mechanism shut. I remembered the small bottle of machine oil I'd seen on the workbench near the stairs. I fetched it, my movements frantic, and doused the hinges and the central spindle. As I waited for the oil to seep in, I whispered a silent prayer to the man who had built this sanctuary. "Grandfather, help me save what you built." I tried again. This time, with a piercing metallic shriek that sounded like a scream in the quiet basement, the wheel began to turn. The mechanism was a combination lock, but there were no numbers etched into the steel. Instead, there were 3 concentric rings with small raised notches. I closed my eyes, trying to recall the stories grandfather used to tell me about the family's sacred dates. Julian never listened to those stories. He'd always rolled his eyes and checked his watch. But I remembered. I aligned the first ring to the day the first oak was planted on the property. The second ring went to the year my grandmother arrived from the old country. For the final ring, I took a gamble. I turned it to the date of my own birth. The day grandfather told me the line of the house was finally secure. A series of heavy, muffled clicks echoed from within the door. It was the sound of iron tumblers falling into place, a mechanical symphony that felt like my grandfather's hand guiding mine. The wheels spun freely now, and with a final heavy heave, the door swung open on silent, well-oiled internal hinges. Behind it lay a small dry stone chamber. It was clean, devoid of the dust that choked the rest of the basement. On a small wooden pedestal sat a locked tin box and a single weathered leather satchel. My breath hitched as I reached for the satchel, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped it. I sat on the cold floor and opened the satchel. Inside, nestled between old silver coins and bundles of letters tied in ribbon, was a thick crimson folder. It was sealed with heavy red wax, bearing the same oak tree crest as the ring on my finger. I broke the seal with a trembling thumb. Inside was a secondary deed, hand-drawn and notarized by a man who had been dead for 40 years. My eyes flew over the elegant looping script. It was a codicil, a legal trapdoor Silas had built into the very fabric of the estate. It stated clearly that while the male heirs might manage the land, the title of the house itself was tied to the matriarchal seal. The legal language was dense but unmistakable. The property could not be transferred, sold, or demolished without the written and notarized consent of the oldest living female descendant of the Silas line. That was me. Julian's contract with the developers was a house of cards, built on a lie of sole ownership. He had committed fraud, thinking he could bypass the women of the family as if we were nothing more than decorative furniture. I clutched the paper to my chest, a sob of relief finally breaking through the tension. I wasn't a trespasser. I was the owner. And Julian was about to find out that tradition had a very different meaning than the one he'd invented. At the very bottom of the tin box I found one last item, a heavy golden key and a small handwritten note on yellowed parchment. The ink was faded but still legible. For the one who remembers the dust, it read, "A family is not a business, it is a promise. If you are reading this, someone has tried to break that promise. Use this key to unlock the true weight of your inheritance. This is the trap for the greedy and the shield for the loyal." I realized then that the golden key wasn't for a door, but for a safety deposit box at the local bank, one that likely held the original untampered with will. I stood up, the crimson folder tucked securely under my arm and the golden key cold against my palm. I looked around the dark basement one last time. The fear that had haunted me since I found the locks changed was gone, replaced by a searing righteous anger. Julian had tried to sell my soul for a sports car and a vanity project. He had treated our father's legacy like a fire sale. But he had forgotten one vital thing. The foundation of Oak Haven wasn't made of wood or stone. It was made of the secrets he was too proud to learn. I climbed back out through the coal chute, but I didn't return to the shed. I walked toward the front of the house, my head held high, waiting for the sun to rise on the day Julian's world would come crashing down. The dawn light broke over the oak trees in long, jagged streaks of gold, finding me sitting on the porch swing of the house I had broken back into. I hadn't slept. I had spent the remaining hours of darkness in the upstairs study, cleaning the soot from my face and hands, the crimson folder resting firmly on my lap. Around 8 in the morning, the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the crunch of tires on gravel. I watched through the jasmine vines as Julian's blue sports car led a small convoy of black SUVs up the driveway. My brother stepped out, looking refreshed and sharp in a charcoal suit, followed by 3 men carrying leather briefcases, the architects of the destruction he had planned for my home. Julian marched up the steps, laughing at something one of the developers said, his hand already reaching for the new key in his pocket. He didn't see me until he reached the top landing. When his eyes finally met mine, he froze, his hand suspended in midair. The color drained from his face, replaced quickly by a mask of indignant rage. "Sarah? What on earth are you doing here?" I told you to clear your things out of the shed and be gone. This is a private closing. He turned to the men behind him, his voice tight with embarrassment. I'm sorry, gentlemen, my sister is having a bit of a difficult time letting go. Emotional attachment can be such a messy thing. I stood up slowly, the crimson folder held at my side. I didn't look like a woman who was having a difficult time. I looked like a woman who had finally found her footing. It's not an emotional problem, Julian. It's a legal one. I stepped forward, blocking the front door, and held out the folder. You told these men you were the sole heir with the right to sell Oak Haven. You took their money based on a lie. This document, recovered from grandfather's private vault last night, contains a codicil that explicitly states this property cannot be sold without my signature as the oldest female descendant. You've committed fraud, Julian. And you've brought these gentlemen along to witness the moment your deal falls apart. The head developer, a man with silver hair and a face like granite, stepped forward and snatched the folder from my hand. Julian tried to grab it, his movements frantic and desperate, but the man pushed him aside. As the developer flipped through the yellowed parchment, his eyes widened and he began to shake his head. Julian, you told us the title was clear. You swore there were no secondary claims. The atmosphere on the porch shifted instantly from a celebratory business deal to a crime scene. Julian began to stammer, his arrogance crumbling into a pathetic high-pitched whine about family traditions and male inheritance. But no one was listening to him anymore. The sound of another car approaching cut through the shouting. It was a dusty, sensible sedan driven by Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer who had served my grandfather for 40 years. I had called him at 6 a.m. and he had arrived with the original untampered-with will from the bank safety deposit box, the one my golden key matched. Mr. Henderson climbed the stairs with a heavy, purposeful gait, his briefcase clicking open before he even reached the top. I'm afraid she's right, Julian, Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of undisputed authority. Silas was a very thorough man. He knew your father's weaknesses and he certainly knew yours. This house was never yours to sell. I watched my brother's face. It was a fascinating, terrible thing to behold. The transition from smugness to a sickly, pale terror. He looked at the sports car in the driveway, then at the furious developers and finally at me. He realized in that moment that the money he had already spent, the wire transfers he'd used to fund his new lifestyle, was now a debt he could never repay. He had sold a soul he didn't own and the bill was coming due. The developers didn't stay long. They left with threats of lawsuits and police reports, leaving Julian standing on the porch, looking small and hollow against the backdrop of the house he had tried to kill. We moved into the kitchen, the very heart of the home, where the morning sun hit the old linoleum in warm patches. Julian sat at the table, his head in his hands, trying to weave one last web of charm. Sarah, please, he whispered. I was just trying to look out for us. I thought I could invest the money and take care of you. If you go through with this, I'll lose everything. They'll put me in jail. You wouldn't do that to your own brother, would you? He looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, trying to find the emotional sister he thought he could always manipulate. I looked at the scuff marks on the floor and the dent in the refrigerator where we'd bumped into it as kids. You didn't just sell a house, Julian. You tried to sell our history. You tried to erase the only thing Dad and Grandfather worked for so you could drive a car that makes you look important. You locked me out of my own life. I leaned over the table, my voice low and unwavering. I'm not bailing you out. You can figure out how to pay those people back on your own. But you will never step foot on this property again. You are no longer part of the legacy of Oak Haven. I saw the last spark of hope die in his eyes, replaced by a cold, bitter realization that his power over me was gone forever. The locksmith arrived an hour later. It was a different man this time, a local I'd known since middle school. I stood on the porch and gave the orders, my voice clear and firm. As he worked on the front door, Julian's things, his expensive luggage, his designer shoes, and the remnants of his betrayal, were placed in neat boxes on the driveway. I didn't feel the surge of revenge I thought I would. I felt a profound sense of cleaning. I was scrubbing the grease of his greed off the walls. When the final box was set out, I handed Julian his keys to the car, the only thing he truly had left, and pointed toward the road. The thud of the front door closing behind him was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was heavy, final, and resonated through the very bones of the house. I watched through the window as he loaded his car, his movements slow and defeated, and drove away without looking back. The the silence that followed was beautiful. It wasn't the silence of an empty house, but the silence of a house that was finally at peace, no longer bracing itself for the blow of a sledgehammer. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, feeling the roots Grandfather Silas had talked about finally settling back into the earth. As the sun began to set, casting deep orange and violet hues over the oak trees, I pulled my grandfather's old wingback chair to the window. I sat there for a long time, the golden key and the signet ring resting on the table beside me. I looked at my hands. They were scratched and stained with coal dust, but they were the hands of the owner. I realized then that the final gift wasn't just the legal documents or the vault of coins. It was the test itself. Grandfather Silas had built a trap for the greedy to ensure that the house would only ever belong to the person who loved it enough to look for its secrets in the dark. I watched the first stars appear over the garden, the jasmine smelling sweeter than ever before. I was the oldest female descendant, the keeper of the seal and the guardian of Oak Haven. The battle was over, and for the first time in my life I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the house wrap around me, a silent promise kept across generations. I was home, and this time the locks would never change again.